All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am Rachel GOGEL. My pronouns are she, her. And you may not tell because I don't have much of an accent, but I actually am from Paris, France. I'm a creative director, designer, educator, and speaker. And as I just mentioned, I'm based in San Francisco. So my day is just starting. I just want to say, similar to Jay, thank you so much to the Smashing Mag team for having me. And I'm here to share some personal stories and experiences on the topic of future-proofing brands that hopefully will spark some inspiration and fun discussion. So let's get started. And when talking about future-proofing brands, part of that is obviously sharing learnings or staying ahead of the curve. But it's worth noting and really being honest about what future-proofing can actually mean. And so my talk should really have an asterisk in the title. And really the subhead should be learnings for staying ahead of the curve most of the time. Because as we all know, nothing is truly future-proof because there are a million unknowns. Brands, businesses, or projects aren't guaranteed to survive for a plethora of reasons. But embracing new technologies and ways of thinking really can keep brands relevant in times of transition. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So to kick us off, I'd actually love to see a show of hands in the chat. The first question is, who is pessimistic about the design industry based on current emerging tech and innovation? So raise your virtual hand if you're feeling pessimistic or you're not sure, maybe you're in between. Awesome. Okay, and then what about who is optimistic? And then again, raise your virtual hand if you're optimistic about the design industry based on current emerging technology and innovation. And obviously, based on where you are, that may mean something different, but awesome. So thanks so much for sharing how you're feeling. Again, I think it's important to kind of get a sense of how we're all feeling in the virtual room. But on my end, I would say that I'm more of an optimist. I believe that there's no better time to actually be doing what we're doing. We're living in a time when it is more critical than ever for people and organizations to know who they are, what they stand for, and what they're here to do. And as you just alluded to a moment ago in kind of setting me up for this talk, not all brands are passing the test right now. But I do think that people are demanding more from companies than at any other time in history. And that is actually really exciting to me. So for me, there's been a new design renaissance happening. These days, maybe it means leveraging emerging technology to not only democratize, but question art, filmmaking, advertising, design, and many creative processes beyond our wildest imaginations. And it's moving really quickly, but I'm optimistic about the potential of our industry, the world of digital product, visual design. I did want to acknowledge, while we're on this topic, I recently saw Gary Hustwitz's most recent, what he's calling generative documentary on Brian Eno. I highly recommend it. I don't want to spoil it, but check it out. It's leveraging just amazing new technology to essentially question more traditional forms of filmmaking and documentary storytelling. If you don't know who Gary Hustwit is, he also directed Helvetica, Objectified, etc. But really, brands are taking more risks and taking stands in order to be remembered. They're expected to communicate something in the brand that will help consumers make a difference in their lives. But it does have to be authentic because consumers have a strong bullshit meter. A brand should be the reflection of its company vision, principles, and values. And having worked in product and building brands over the years, one's product experience is one's brand experience. And the more powerful brands today are leveraging emerging technology and evolving trends to create more memorable experiences to reach people wherever they are. For example, one of the examples here on the right, Runway ML, if you're less aware of this particular tool, they specialize in generative artificial intelligence research and technologies, especially in video generation. But they create a limited edition printed magazine called Telescope, which goes to show just the love of print still remains and how people are longing still for tangible physical artifacts. And this is, again, like an AI tool that is thinking about how to reach their audience and innovate, despite kind of living digitally, but creating something that is physical. So I've been so inspired by what I've observed in our field over the last few years that I actually decided to take the leap into solopreneurship just a few short years ago. So in October 2020, I decided to leave my last full-time job at Godfrey Dadich Partners, which is a small design studio headquartered in the Bay Area, to become my own boss and build out a solo venture. And like many creative leaders during this time, I've been on a journey to understand how to manage teams remotely, but now with the added challenge of also being an independent contractor. Now, I thought I'd set the scene by sharing a little bit more about my background, career journey, and why I'm here. So let's start off with some personal fun facts. I don't want to get into the professional background just yet, but just to set the scene, this is an illustrated version of me with slightly shorter hair. Currently, I live with my wife, Susanna, back home in San Francisco, but I was actually born in Paris, France. I was there until going to university. This is young me with bangs. And to set the scene, I've been playing basketball since the 90s. This is one of my favorite movies. My first CD was by Alanis Morissette. But most importantly, and more relevant to today, I was surrounded by typography and art, and have always been drawn to mixed media and collage. I've been a design and typography nerd who loves vintage magazines, bold graphics, packaging. I even owned a BlackBerry phone pre-iPhone release. And it's worth noting that I love art that tends to highlight really confident assertions of female liberation, such as this example by Tamara de Lempicka. And then lastly, thinking back to living in Europe as a teenager, I was often communicating with friends using AIM, MSN, ICQ, obviously all the acronyms, but more importantly, the Photoshop icon was still a feather when I was exploring design. So speaking of design tools and art, here's what I'm drawn to personally. Lots of playful type, color blocking, and art that really holds more deep, meaningful, layered messages. I graduated from from a university in Philadelphia called the University of Pennsylvania in 2009 with a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Arts and a major in communication design and a minor in anthropology. It's worth noting, again, that at the time there was no official design major, and I was one of only 2 people graduating with a major in communication design my year. And for anyone observing or affected by the volatile job market right now, I understand what it's like, because there was a recession in the United States when I was looking for a job. It was really hard to get one, and my skills and early internships didn't matter. No one was hiring, but a lot has changed since then. And here's a snapshot of my career journey since. So while I may have left uni without a job lined up, I have since led major initiatives, both in-house and agency side. And some brands that you may recognize here are GQ, the New York Times, Facebook, now Meta, Godfrey Dadich Partners, which is that studio that I mentioned based in the Bay Area, Departures Magazine, Airbnb, and Dropbox. But beyond this, I've sought to influence the next creative generation as a design educator at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco, coincidentally, the same school that Jay mentioned he used to be an adjunct at. And I've also been on boards. I am a mentor on a few global platforms such as ADP List, if you want to find me there. But in looking back at my career journey and what's kind of most relevant to why I'm here, and this talk is actually mapping it to this rise and dominance of an entire era of digital design, from building mobile commerce apps for the first generation of the iPhone to navigating how to advertise on the iPad, to optimizing content for mobile devices and everything in between. You see, I became a designer post-internet and email boom, and I've had to navigate new software and technology emerging throughout my whole career, essentially democratizing design for all. And the pandemic has only accelerated this kind of digital transformation. I will note, though, that I don't consider myself an early adopter, but I've always been an early observer, which means that I tend to wait a beat for things to settle before figuring out what feels like it's worth learning so that I can help my employers or clients navigate these big seismic shifts in culture due to emerging technology. Finally, I'll admit that since 2020, I basically live in Figma and a few AI tools such as Anthropic's Claude. And while my formal training is in graphic design, I have influenced many exciting projects for my clients, from shaping org design to launching editorial publications, pitch decks, I know you mentioned earlier in my intro, for TV shows and things like that, but everything in between. I find myself committed to designing teams that build brands with a big focus on technology and culture. Recently, I enjoy saying, or I think what feels most relevant is I really enjoy designing how people work. So it's not always a tangible design artifact. And as a fractional design executive and really passionate people manager, I often dedicate my time to fostering spaces that unlock human potential. I thought I would quickly highlight a few of these projects next. So I'm going to focus on launching a cover-to-cover AR magazine when I was at GQ. I'm going to hint at the learnings from building New York Times's T-Brand Studios in-product native ads. I also reimagined a legacy lifestyle publication for American Express called Departures Magazine. And I helped create very complex visual systems for the Facebook app. So let's dig into each of these. Let's start with GQ. So for those of you less familiar with GQ, GQ has actually always been ahead of the curve in terms of content innovation. My job was to rethink the quality of the advertising or advertorials and really disrupt the editorial industry. We needed a September 2012 hook to get our loyal subscribers back to the actual newsstands. This is when you could, or people were buying more, print publications on the newsstand. But I had the opportunity to launch a print to mobile augmented reality app called GQ Live, which essentially brought the printed September 2012 issue to life, cover to cover, which meant that you basically hovered your phone over pages and then something would happen on your screen. We also looked for personalizing the iPad experience for GQ readers with a special app called My GQ. This was a peak time for what was called interactive print. So again, set the scene. The iPad was relatively new. The iPhone had been out for a few years, but this was something that people were really excited about. We actually earned a Mobile Excellence Award back in the day. But to give you a quick sense of how quickly tech has changed, even on laptops, if anyone remembers this Esquire cover, this was only in 2009. But if you just take a minute to read what's on the screen here on the side in terms of the instructions of how to get started, at its core, you needed to make sure that your laptop had a working webcam for this to even happen. So there was no, dependency on your mobile phone just yet. You were still, installing webcam attachments to your laptop or your computer. And this was only in 2009. So when in 2012, this idea of being able to just download an app and hover your phone over a printed page, you can imagine, again, just how much excitement there was, or people were feeling like, this idea of wanting to be part of it. And while the app was only around for, let's say, 3 years or so, the only reason we launched it was because it mapped to the brand strategy. GQ, has always been known for being one of the first publications on the iPad, which came out in about 2010 or so. And so being the first to launch an app like this should be no different. We wanted at the time to push the brand forward and keep satisfying our community of readers who were and still are avid tech users. And the reality is, adding a GQ Live little logo on ads and editorial definitely produced results. We reached over 128 countries. By the time I left in GQ in 2014, we had over 120,000 downloads of the app. We worked with 150 advertisers to activate their ads. And it was just this really interesting time where we were experimenting with technology, and other publications, as you can see here, followed suit as the technology ended up getting white labeled by Condé Nast. All right, so the New York Times. If you didn't know, this paper and media brand or amazing brand was born in the 1850s. But now reading the Times is part of many people's lifestyle and daily ritual, and it has been for decades. So I joined in 2014 after I left GQ, just as the term native advertising was being coined. And this was the time when the New York Times innovation report was leaked. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it revealed many of its plans to increase digital subscription and reimagine the newsroom model. It was made clear very quickly that in joining the New York Times, I had to help build a multidisciplinary team of creatives really focused on high quality advertising in order to open up a potential revenue stream for the company. So at the time, their new CEO, or not new anymore, but their current CEO, Meredith Levine, was my boss. That's really when T-Brand Studio, so this in-house content studio, officially launched. And in just the span of a few months that same year, native advertising started to account for 10% of the digital revenue, thanks to some 40 brands that worked with us back then. And in 2015, 130 campaigns had launched since the studio's inception, and it just grew from there. I will note that it took a lot of time to gain the trust of the newsroom at the beginning. But as the years went by and T-Brand's work became more known and better quality, it just felt like the New York Times. Again, to set the scene in terms of design tools, this was also pre-Figma. One of my proudest achievements, though, while there was introducing new promotional units throughout the Times ecosystem that would drive people to our work. So just think about the traffic from the New York Times homepage. The key, though, was to create something that wouldn't confuse readers as being journalism and yet fit with the overall look and feel. Why should a promotional unit look ugly? Wouldn't that affect the brand look and feel overall? We didn't want to introduce anything that would affect the brand's existing credibility and trust. And sometimes, you assume that whatever is happening on advertising or marketing should feel different or less than. But really, my goal was to make sure that it felt integrated and wouldn't affect the brand perception. If anything, it could only help it. This was also a time where I was having big discussions with other leads across the organization about the New York Times brand's role and how the changing landscape of advertising could fit within the larger picture. So similar to GQ, the Times was and is increasingly known for being on the cutting edge of innovation and technology, whether through virtual reality storytelling or their amazing interactive data visualizations. I was just trying to translate their brand strategy into visual outputs cross-platform that not only could align with their values and deliver story-driven experiences, but also ultimately could help them develop new revenue streams. All right, the third example. So imagine the pandemic as our backdrop. I was enlisted by an agency called Giant Spoon, who had just won this account through American Express, to execute the overhaul for Departures magazine. And it's worth noting that Departures had been around for almost 40 years. But with the pandemic as our backdrop, I started really pushing for building brand identity and product design systems entirely in Figma, which, as we all, or many of us may know, is a great collaborative design tool that's been rising in popularity. But they were my first client when going out on my own as an independent designer and creative lead. American Express, as I said, really had been running this 40-year-old brand. They started in 1984 as a lifestyle publication focusing on luxury and travel for American Express cardholders, and historically had been known to being really just in print. And so the goal here was to reimagine Departures as a digital first publication. I was brought in as a fractional executive creative director. I oversaw a creative team of freelancers that built this completely new brand identity system to usher in this next generation of Departures that embraced this digital first model. And this was the brand's first redesign in over a decade. And so to tell compelling stories, we devised key principles to guide and unify the creation and innovation of our editorial, product, and partnership work streams all in one, with the brand at the core. I think part of having this small, nimble team, and also in my role, meant that I had oversight across all work streams, really unifying these work streams through these key principles. And Departures became a prism for reflecting all facets of the human journey. So once again, I influenced the development of premium native ad formats alongside the new brand identity and product design. And in just a few short months, we delivered inspiration mixed with utility. We not only built the new brand identity system and guidelines, but executed it in such a way that it informed the launch of the digital experience, a newsletter product, proprietary ad solutions, and social channels. And by this point, we had also reimagined the publishing model by merging 5 distinct and distributed companies and establishing a one-team culture. We were building one ecosystem, despite kind of all living around the world. Again, we were building this amidst the pandemic as our backdrop. We weren't meeting in person. This was all done virtually. Our work did earn a Webby nomination in 2022 and other press recognition in the design industry and beyond. Unfortunately, American Express did decide to cease the beloved brand's publication in January of this year. As we all know, again, as I said at the beginning of today's talk, you can imagine things to be future-proof, but obviously there are some unforeseen contexts and circumstances that make things change. And last but not least, my Facebook experience. Now, most people here probably know the history of Meta than Facebook, but if not, it launched in February of 2004. And it's not an exaggeration when I say that a lot has changed in 20 years in terms of the brand's perception around the world, especially in the Western world. For context, Zuckerberg was Time's Person of the Year in 2010, which is about when Facebook had its 500 millionth user earlier that year. Maybe these were the glory days. I don't know. Obviously, the product has gone through a lot since then. I moved to San Francisco thanks to Facebook in 2016, when there were about only 16,000 employees or so. There was, different types of press around the app and the product or the brand overall at the time. But that being said, I think I joined at a very interesting time when we were developing Facebook's or the Facebook app, should I say, their visual voice. Through systems such as emojis, illustration, color, icons, photography, and reactions, the colorful backgrounds that you use to update your status. We used extensive component libraries and definitely embraced a fast-paced working environment. You can imagine that building complex visual systems for now close to 3 billion users was challenging. For me, it was about 2 billion users at the time, but it was also a great learning experience. So the reality is Facebook realized it did have a brand problem. And when I was there was no brand strategy. They are a product and engineering-led organization, so brand wasn't important to them at the time. But as the user base grew, they realized that every interaction with the product influenced perception of the brand. I was in the room with executives as we were figuring this out. I was also there when the Facebook app went from the top blue Chrome to white in 2019. But part of this exercise forced them to truly figure out who they were or who they are before really investing in what they look like, or at least this kind of future state of what they should look like. Figuring out the role of the in-product brand voice really became a priority, which is what I was there to do. How do we support our users without maybe being too loud in their feeds? How often should Facebook, the brand, talk to their users in the app experience, or should we be more in the background? What is the right balance for that type of communication? Meta was also where I truly learned how to embrace discomfort. I had just left publishing, as I noted earlier, which was my comfort zone. That was where I started my career. And imagine just joining a tech company like Facebook, moving across the United States, and I basically had to learn a new language. Convincing engineers to buy into a creative concept really takes skills that I did not have when I joined. For context, I was initially asked to manage a team of papercraft artists and develop culturally relevant messages for their newsfeed. So you may be asking yourself, papercraft artist, what is that? So I am not kidding when I say that literally Facebook invested in hiring some of the best papercraft artists in the world. So literally people who maybe have backgrounds in building theater sets and really have an amazing attention to detail. But they were sitting at their desks in Silicon Valley building these physical paper products that we would then shoot in a room with on camera and then place in people's digital feeds. So while papercraft is no longer their go-to storytelling medium at Facebook, I still look back at this time as a major rewarding experience. So what you see on the slide is an example of something we built by hand in 2017 for Pride, and then shot it in this small studio, which, to be honest, was really a conference room that we turned into a photo studio, but then it went into people's feeds. Most people assume that this was all done digitally, or we built it to CGI or another kind of animation tool, but it was crafted by hand. Unfortunately, we weren't actively telling that story, like people physically building these, beautiful, physical, tangible objects, that there were humans behind them. I think that was the idea. But as you can imagine, this is really hard to scale when you're serving 2 billion people at the time. Now, there was a saying at Facebook that we're only 1% finished. And it truly did feel that way, especially when you're serving that many people around the world. So I think it's important to diagnose your own visual voice and make sure that you're offering a scalable and diversified visual toolkit. I was there when we were building our first illustration style called Allegria with a studio called Buck. But then soon after, we had to keep introducing new storytelling techniques like motion and photography and different illustration styles, because it really did start to limit us. I also joined when most visual assets felt really decorative, or like they just had to fill white space in the app. They lacked story, they lacked purpose. For context, again, just in terms of volume, we were creating over 4,000 assets in one half of a year alone. So things moved really quickly, and they are continuing to evolve. I like knowing that this team, Visual Systems, still exists today, and they're doing great work. But this is when the importance of having one-on-one meetings with people across the organization became even more critical for me. Although I had started doing this at GQ and the New York Times as well, but spending time with others, practicing active listening, learning more about how other teams work, especially engineers and product folks, and really learning the tech acronyms, it can unlock better working relationships and projects in development. So at Facebook, I spent a lot of time meeting with individuals across the product, engineering, and marketing teams in order to build trust as we were trying something new and we wanted to involve them. And this was a huge unlock for problem solving as well. I learned, to lean on my peers, and still to this day, I really know how powerful one-on-one sessions can be with cross-functional individuals. It also helped us really break down the silos between the teams and getting people more invested in building brands and evolving brands together, and having them really understand how visual design and product design inherently complement one another. So that said, as design really changed technology over the last 2 decades, technology has also changed design. And this is something that I say a lot, whether I'm teaching in the classroom or even with clients. So again, important to set the scene, disruptions like the iPhone and Facebook did emerge around the start of my career. And they were fringe novelties that really have solidified into essential, if not predictable, tools. Software and hardware design really have become increasingly monotonous as designers tend to build on each other's work and innovate less. Designers are definitely adhering to the rules that create these sleek, sophisticated products, but the result tends to be generic or boring. There's been a lot of fear and ignorance and a lot of settling. Most product and digital designers today even lack training in basic visual design principles around typography, hierarchy, color, grid, graphics, and overarching design direction. And so again, this is just my observation, especially knowing where I live and kind of the types of clients that I work with. But there is an indifference now. And as Dieter Ram suggests in this quote, no one really says good or bad anymore. They say interesting. And I'm not sure we can afford to be so indifferent. And this really sits and it hits a chord for me. I've even watched digital design teams go through extreme over-specialization. From where I stand, when I was starting my career, there were really two titles. You could be a web designer or a graphic designer. And maybe even as a graphic designer, you would learn about web and vice versa. But now there's just so much more specialization. I'm sure this list doesn't encompass all titles that exist today, but from where I stand, design needs more conviction, maybe less specialization. Some recent research also shows that the ability to embrace change and adapt to technological and social changes will be the most critical skill to have in the future, followed by a focus on developing cross-disciplinary skills. So the best employers that I meet with and talk to do and have been valuing designers for how they think just as much as what they've made. So in a way, I want to be hearing more people talk about how to ruin digital design. I love the ethos behind this because it's important to consider just the power of imperfections in the design process too. Scott Dadich, who's one of my mentors, former managers of Godfrey Dadich, and the co-creator of a Netflix series called The Abstract, The Art of Design, he developed a name for this kind of decision-making. He called it wrong theory. So Dadich describes the cycle as a trend from experimentation to perfection, and then back towards ruining the status quo. But let's be clear, wrong theory isn't necessarily about making design unusable. Importantly, the output must be and remain highly functional. My learning and main recommendation here is to cheat it, but only if you know what you're doing. So you have to lean into feeling uncomfortable about your creation because you're probably on track towards a breakthrough. I believe that personal discomfort, so that real, deeply felt creative unease, is essential to meaningful progress in digital and product design. So I'd like to close with some principles and perhaps set an intention that could inspire you all as you think about future-proofing your own brands and digital design systems moving forward. Hopefully just kind of hearing some anecdotes about my experience and then some overarching thoughts on where we should go next sparked some inspiration no matter where you are today. But let's close in on 6 principles that really have served me no matter where I am or no matter what I'm working on. So the first, delight over expectation, really just this idea of building systems and experiences that become more compelling the more you engage with them. And really focus on the subtle yet important details that ensure you always show and not tell. The second is impact over attention. So really thinking about looking at hierarchy, scale, color to help deliver your point of view, not distract from it. It's not just about getting people to notice, it's about getting people to think, to feel, to act. The third principle, relevance over trendiness. This is a big one. Your creations really should seek to be meaningful in the long term. I would recommend not chasing likes or follows and really seeking to build something that can be an exemplar for decades, not just days. The fourth principle, function over decoration. So in this case, really embracing elements that aid in understanding, wayfinding, and discovery, really steering clear of anything that distracts from the experience or even impedes engagement. The fifth, rigor over chance. Really knowing that studying that what has worked in the past really can help you create solutions for the future. Mindful repetition is imperative for mastery, and don't rely on happy accidents. Don't see hope as a strategy. Really, really push on rigor, and always measuring twice and maybe cutting once. And then last but not least, this is huge, is constraints over limitations. And there is a very clear distinction between the two. So as designers really thriving on solving problems with fixed parameters and ignoring artificial limits on where your work can go. Embrace the challenge of a narrow brief. Constraints can be really, really helpful in our process. And I think that's it. We did it. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And I really like closing on a quote from one of my mentors, also a client of mine, a fabulous human. Her name's Jacqueline Novogratz. She's the founder and CEO of a company called Acumen. But she said, what if we measured true success not by the amount of money you have, but by the amount of human energy you unlock, the amount of potential you enable? If that were our metric, our world would be a different place. So it reminds me often about the responsibility that we have as designers, as creators, and the good that we can put out into the world if we want to. And so I hope this inspires you just as much as it inspires me. And I think that's it. Thank you so much for having me today. Thanks again to the Smashing Mag team. And I know there's going to be some questions, but if you want to connect with me on any of these platforms, and then this QR code can bring you to my website as well. But yeah, just so much I could go on for hours, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Wow, I absolutely loved the quote in the end as well. It really got me thinking, I have to say. And thank you for the insights, and quite incredible to see all the work, really like very different work, I have to say as well, really going to come along nicely. I have some questions I'd like to ask, and I know that we're a little bit behind schedule here, but just wanted to bring them up.
Sure.
One of them, it's kind of really interesting. I think that I'm going to watch out if wonderful audiences has some questions or not. But one thing that I've always been wondering, and maybe this is the moment of truth when I'm actually getting to find an answer to that question. I feel like there are two roles or two sides of every brand. On the one hand, you want to be flexible enough. So whenever something happens, whenever AI happens, whenever, I don't know, TikTok happens, whenever whatever happens, you kind of want to be not too far behind. Right, you don't want to be maybe necessarily there at the moment when things happen, but you don't want to be too far behind. Right. On the other hand, you also need to have something firm, something that people can stand behind, something like principles, values, something that's unshakable, right? But that sometimes also can have an impact on, this notion of flexibility. Let's do this, let's try that, let's experiment, let's go, right? How do you walk this fine line between the two? Or is it kind of between the two, or is it kind of two parallels where you have to walk on the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So let's say when I was working in tech, I mean, there was a motto, which maybe many people have heard, but this idea of moving fast and breaking things. And I guess this question is, well, if you move too fast and you keep breaking things and you're not grounded in some kind of vision or values or something, are you missing something, or are your priorities different, or can you still reach people where they are, or how, I think they're not necessarily two kind of parallel tracks. I think there's a way to embrace innovation, emerging technology, experiment, and like still, think about your users, kind of really be thoughtful and meaningful. And, so that may mean slow down in certain moments in time, or at least kind of question some of the decisions that you make. But I don't think it's like a either or thing. I think you can do both. But it does come from the top. Like, I think your leaders need to care. They need to, make it known that it's a priority. I think that you can create a lot of change from the bottom up, to the top. So if you have ideas, and was always drawn to these technologies. I wasn't always in a leadership role, but kind of convincing stakeholders. I know Jay talked about this a little bit too, is kind of building and fostering those relationships, speaking their language, getting them to see that it may be of value to either invest time or resources or whatever that may be into trying something out. But I remember anecdotally when I was at GQ, after launching that GQ Live app, and I wanted and was hungry to do more, there was, I kind of hit a moment where my publisher kind of reminded me, hey, maybe we should pause and like just hold on for a second. I'm not sure it's possible to do what you're looking for here. That was good for now, and let's maybe pause on some of the more innovative technologies and do what we do best. And again, sometimes it's like not the right time. Sometimes it depends on who's in charge. Sometimes it depends on the priorities. My biggest takeaway though is just kind of just being aware of what's going on in culture, in trends, in technology. I think having an awareness and being able to observe and acknowledge like when maybe it's right for you to play or engage versus, you kind of ignoring it or thinking it's over there and not wanting to engage at all. I think there's kind of a difference. So that would be my kind of reaction to that question. Is like stay curious,
Yeah, that makes sense. I also wondering in general, so like if at some point, let's say you go too far and you experiment too much and something happens, like I think that every other brand experiences at some point this notion of brand crisis, I guess is the right word for it. And it could also be not because you experiment with something ridiculous and you do something negative or whatever, but you're slow and you're kind of stuck behind. And I feel, and obviously you know way more about this than I do, but I feel like sometimes there is this magical moment where somebody in the company says, okay, if we want to be perceived, if we want to be noticeable, if we want to be visible, big rebrand. We just need to go like change everything, be bold, provoke, make people think about us. There is no bad publicity, just do whatever it takes. How would you actually get out of a brand crisis if you are there? Yeah. Is it like would you say that it's better to go slowly, or is it really like something has to shake right away so for the brand to be perceived differently?
Yeah. It's hard because I would say it depends on the context. A big rebrand is not always the right way to solve a problem. And I do think people assume that, let's just get a facelift and everything will be fine. And so sometimes maybe that's the right move. And yes, there's definitely a way to do that more quickly. And then maybe there's a way to do that maybe the right way or a little bit more intentionally. Either way, I do think that most rebrands really, people should start thinking about them not as just a facelift. So like not just affecting the look and feel, but also, reflecting on what are the values? Are we expressing those intentionally? Does our product actually, is our product a reflection of what we're saying out in the world and our communication? So there was a slide earlier about the kind of one ecosystem. And that's my belief is that, yes, you can change one thing and maybe that'll affect and help your brand crisis, as you called it, or like shape brand perception in some way. But often you kind of have to think about the entire ecosystem. So like how the product user experience feels, what you're saying on your marketing website, how you're treating talent when you're interviewing them, to join the team. Like all of these things really can move the needle better if you're understanding how all of these experiences actually affect the brand perception versus just focusing on the logo or making a big update to your app experience, but nothing else. And you called it, when you introduced me earlier, I do think that consumers are just more demanding from brands today than ever before. And so it's harder for brands to survive because if they're using some of their old tricks and they're not working and they don't know why, it's because maybe they're not in touch with what's needed today in order to become a resilient brand that feels more timeless and can truly become a little bit more future-proof than other brands. And you'll notice which ones are standing out today versus the ones that are not.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent. Wow. That's went really deep, really quickly. Just maybe one final question before we wrap up. And I'm just really curious.
Sure.
Rachel, do you remember your ICQ number?
My what? Oh, my ICQ number. Well, it probably was the same as my AIM, like
I don't know,
screen
maybe.
name. I don't
never
know.
really use
That's
AIM.
my assumption, which was my it was my first name spelled backwards, which I know wasn't original because a lot of people did that. So I think
Including
it was
myself, by the way.
what? Including you?
Including myself.
Yeah. So I think it was LEHCAR with my birthday, which again,
Right.
not original, but I think it was that.
I hope it was not the password, though.
No, no,
Okay,
it wasn't the
that's good to know.
password.
That's good to know. So, dear friends, if you are looking to connect or reconnect with Rachel on ICQ, which happens to be still around from what it was actually, I think it was rebranded, like
I
big
think so
time.
too. Yeah, I will say I'm no longer on that today, but who
Oh,
knows? Maybe
Yeah.
one day when I move back to Europe, I'll have to join again.
No, I don't think I don't know if anybody wants to share their ICQ numbers, that would be the time. But I don't think that this is a thing anymore.
Yeah.
This is at least my feeling. Right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us. And everybody, please send a round of cold emoji or ice cream emoji so it doesn't melt. That would be nice. Thank you so much, Rachel, for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and have a great day, everyone.